Okay, good evening. Welcome to another edition of Esoteric Book Club. This week we're talking about the Fool card in Meditations on the Tarot. Um, so as usual, let's go over our overall impressions of the chapter, and then we'll dive into the specifics. It was a longer chapter. I enjoyed it. A bit I found it more of a history lesson than I was expecting, which is cool. But it was very heavy um, on. I didn't like some of the judgments that I saw. I guess I didn't not expect. Again, it was much more palpable than because we've just been reading the material for so long. But yeah, I mean, I ended, but it did with those um judgments, I guess, or whatnot that was made in this chapter. It did inspire a lot of very interesting thought that I'm happy to, I'm excited to share, and just kind of took my mind in very interesting directions with it. So I felt connected. And overall, I like the Joker card for what kind of, yeah, like archetype that it shares with figures around the world. So it was interesting to have him go so heavy into that history of the people and have it be really focused on that for the chapter. So it was good. But yeah, Cody, what were your overall impressions?
Yeah, I really like this chapter. I found it to be very clear, kind of more clear than some other chapters. Um, Packed with a lot of stuff and somewhat repetitive to stuff that already been said. I almost feel like there's like cut and paste on some of it, but that was a little frustrating because sometimes that can be a little bit annoying with his writing. But I like it. I felt like it was a good chapter, like why, like to answer the question why set off on a magical practice,
Mm.
that it is like to do it is foolish. Like it's kind of like it's like you have to make a leap of faith, and we'll talk about that of course in the chapter because I think that's a really important part of it. But so I feel like it was inspiring in that regard, like just to do it. um and that the fool is holy, like, and that like it's dangerous, that it's a narrow path, it's like that razor's edge between like pure materialism and kind of insanity. So like um and it's a noble path. I think after reading this chapter I realized like more than I did before, and I appreciate that a lot.
Agreed. George, how was your impression of this chapter?
Yeah, it's fun. It's a fun chapter. It's actually very engaging as a chapter versus the other chapters in this book. And I mean, I literally started a bath, sat in the bathtub, and finished this entire chapter in one sitting before the water got cold. So it's quite engaging and quite fun. What I really like about this chapter is it really does provide more insight as to what he is doing in this entire book. In his approach in synthesis, as we circled around the sort of the bathtub drain of this conversation of scholasticism, and his take on the primary activity of knowledge that is guided by revelation and faith and contemplation and all of this stuff that essentially is this book. This entire book is like the reflection, the end product of this foolish journey that he has gone on, right? And the approach that he has taken in his synthesis, in his approach of fusing all these disparate elements together, whether by intellectual rigor or by pure revelation. upon his meditations and his prayers. So it's a self revealing chapter about basically the activity of him producing this book for me. And that was insightful to hear the way that he describes it.
Totally agree. Wow. Britannia, I don't know if you want to go over your overall impressions or just hop in whenever you want.
Yeah, I'll be fast. Yeah, I really liked how he broke down why he put the Fool ahead of the last card. And yeah, I agree with like everything that George said. I think he got more personal in this chapter than he's ever gotten in any other chapter, and I really appreciated that. Yeah, I really liked it. I thought it was great. I draw the Fool card quite often, so it was a good one for me to read.
Nice. Cool. Okay. Let's get into it. So Amor, I loved that he started off with Kabbalistic thinking and going into the letter Shin meaning Amor, and how the Fool's journey is a journey of love. I thought that was really interesting. Yeah. The Arcanum, the Fool, corresponds to the letter Shin, that is consequently the number, and consequently the number is 21, and that its esoteric name is love. So yeah, that really kind of pinpointed why he put it here. And I do feel like it makes a lot of sense reading this book. I mean, I feel like the book does correspond with, you know, your life as you read it, or at least I did. So I liked that it was starting back from the beginning. It kind of reflected what some events that happened in the last 2 weeks of reading this was a good reminder that starting up, you know, your magical path is always in a state of rediscovery, and it kind of always comes back to a love of life, of your practice, of yourself, of whatnot, like love. But that was really cool.
I guess the question then is, how is love foolish? And I guess that he goes into that, but
Okay, yeah, does he? Expand on that.
well, yeah, I mean, he gets into that with the examples, like pretty quick. I think the examples of the archetypal fool, um, the what was it, Don Quixote, Don Juan, Faust, Hamlet, that Eulenspiegel guy. I haven't heard of him, but um, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Luigi Eulenspiegel or something. Anyway, and yeah, and Don Juan. Oh yeah, and Orpheus. But yeah, I mean, just like the acts of like doing like being foolish in acts of love, like Orpheus going to the underworld to get Eurydice is foolish, and I mean, he's like, he is a quintessential fool. He's the romantic poet that like believes in a higher ideal in a world that believes in, you know, making money and making, you know, making ends meet. Um, and so yeah, and then Don Juan, of course, like the fool of love. And
Nice.
yeah, so I mean, I think that is like the core of it is like we make this leap for love, like for like this thing we're in love with, despite like outside influence, despite like the potential doubt in our path, you know. Yet we have to make this leap, and to do so is like it's like setting forth on the hero's journey, right? But it's an initial foolish act, an act out of love. Yeah.
Well, I feel like it's too like because he brought it back to like the child kind of in the way like comparing it to the two children and like the sun card. I feel like his ideal state of like purity is that like childlike surrender, and then that like purifies you into just only accepting like that divine surrender of like there is like this higher good that I can align with. And I really like how he kind of acknowledges like the deep trust that it takes within something that's like outside of you, like that faith, to take that leap and that surrender to be the fool. Because it's so pure. Like I think that was one of the points that he was making with all the anecdotal like archetypes of the fool. He was just like they were so pure in their heart and like their pursuit of love in their life, even though, you know, it may not be like the best or the worst examples, but you know what I mean? Like there was a purity there, which I don't know, I really appreciated.
Mhm. Totally agree. So let's go in. I'm trying to see what I highlighted. Yeah, because it was a lot of examples after that. Mm, he starts getting into, somebody help me out. I loved the Cyprian and the Mage part, actually.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he goes into like psychology after that, but that's, we kind of summed up all the, well, yeah, let's talk about Cyprian and the Mage.
Yeah, you're right. He because he represents this like kind of brilliant student who had encounters with the kind of the Aristotelian Platonic world, the philosophical world, and he kind of rejected that for like magic, right?
Hmm.
World of like um, attainment, magical attainment, and then ultimately was sainted by rejecting that. Not necessarily rejecting that, but taking, in his eyes, taking it further into mysticism, into gnosis, and then um, like just like yeah, sacred magic, basically. Um, so kind of like that. So he represents kind of the full cycle that I think this whole chapter represents, right? That cycle of like below, like starting below with philosophy, and
Hmm.
go building on that with from the earth, from the elements, from the different forces, nature, and the universe, and then ultimately coming to God, like bringing God down. So top, bottom up, top down,
Yeah,
coming
interesting.
together.
Because I like, I mean, I haven't read up on, I've heard the name before, Cyprian and the Mage, but I'd never, read up on it. And then it's just interesting, like, yeah, Jake's Staten Kent wrote about him in one of his books. Like that was very, like that was one of the book's topics. So I thought that was really interesting. And yeah, that it was brought up from this context and then, potentially to read the another context in the future, of just what I ordered book wise. So I thought that was kind of cool that that came into my field lately.
Yeah, and they kind of summarize the process on 605 when he says, like, the 21st Arkham of the Tarot is therefore the Hermeticist method of sacrificing the intellect to spirituality in a way such that it grows and develops instead of becoming enfeebled and atrophied, is a marriage of opposites. The discursive intellectuality and the illuminative spirituality. In other words, it is the alchemic work of the union of the human wisdom, which is the folly in the eyes of God, and the divine wisdom, which is the folly in the eyes of man. In which that, and with both which is above and that which is below. So yeah, that's kind of like summing up what Cody said about it. He was just so on the nose in this chapter, which was cool. I really liked it because he like took historical context, personal context, and then was a little bit more decisive in exactly what he wanted to say instead of being like on a journey through the chapter with him. It was I really liked this one a lot. He was very like firm in his answer.
Yeah, agreed. There's not a lot to read into it either. I mean, I feel like we have these long pauses because it's like,
Yeah.
and then he said this, and then he said this, you know?
Well, what do you guys feel about like when he's like subsequently this opposition becomes parallelism,
Hmm.
like a peaceful coexistence of the spiritual and intellectual domains? Like I don't know, like I feel like there is balance in the world, but it's constantly like fighting itself. Like both sides are constantly like ebbing and flowing because I feel like maybe it's because we're like smaller creatures and like hierarchical energy of everything, but we're so close to, just like the earthquakes or natural disasters, things like that that just can like shake your world and make it feel like chaos everywhere. And when he's like asking people to have like a certain type of spirituality, like throughout those circumstances, it makes me wonder, is it just as hard for like higher energies to like rise and stay risen and like keep the frequencies up as it is for us to try and do that, from a lower standpoint? Because the parallelism was kind of interesting to me because I don't know, I was really intrigued by that part of it.
The the distinction he draws is tripart, right? There's opposition, there's parallelism, and then there's union. The non-opposition from it went from opposition to coexistence to essentially moving in the same direction, right? That's the sequence that he describes or suggests as people encounter both revelatory sort of experiences versus a more awakened human experience, and intellect and the non-intellect having to resolve their differences as a primary action of the practice of Hermeticism. And he goes into a rather extensive discussion about that process. But I, just from a personal perspective, I have to say that I strongly resonated with that journey and that sequence. Um, just from my personal experience with encounter, scratching my head, like it doesn't know what to make heads and tails of it, but can't ignore it, and then come to a worldview that's more allowing. So you hold multiple worldviews until you figure out that's kind of silly. You operate in a way that is isolated depending on the context. So you find ways of trying to resolve and to create within yourself that sense of fusion of the different worldviews into one coherent whole, so that you no longer find any conflict, or at least the process of fusing it, much like this book itself, right? It's taking disparate elements and fusing it into something that is basically a coherent system. And I find that to be a thing that is, certainly for me in practice, a primary topic. It's always that question of, well, how do I resolve that, right? How do I be inclusive and be creative and transcend all those confines and all of those edges that make me have to either put them in opposition, make me have to either keep them in parallel worlds, or that's preventing me from being able to successfully fuse these concepts into using a creative process or using an insightful process. So it's a challenge for me, and it does follow that sequence quite closely in my personal experience.
Yeah, I think me too. I think I agree. Even from the very beginning, like having so much skepticism, of any of these practices, kind of like beaten into me by the like materialistic world, like science-based, um, like evidence-based world that we live in. That's so important. Um, and then encountering these ideas that like that do require some like outside leap of faith. Um, but then realizing in this chapter, I think he actually does a pretty good job kind of pointing out that like even that like scientific materialism is like a leap of faith in itself, like the story of that, because it's like you have to believe in their fundamental premises, and like you have to believe that that's getting you somewhere, like that there's something to that to like totally follow that. um and then there is that gap, that place you get where like, what is it, the doubt place, where you get, but yeah, like I'll read this quote even, and this is after he quotes Kierkegaard, which I really liked. But he says, doubt is more than a psychological state of indecision. It is the soul's sojourn to the intermediary sphere between the two fields of attraction, terrestrial and celestial, from which there is no other means of escape than a pure and simple act of faith, issuing from the soul itself without heaven and earth taking any part in it. So there is
I
like,
love that.
yeah. And that's interesting too, because like it gets you to like what is this soul that's in between heaven and earth that's not being influenced by heaven and earth. So that's, I like that's like there's a lot there to meditate on, I think, in that sentence. But there is kind of this place of like there is this celestial, like these higher truths, or these higher, I maybe, and higher, I don't like higher. He uses that word a lot, but I tend to like react to it, but I use it and then I end up using it. But these like kind of transcendent truths, or the like the abstract principles like love or truth and beauty. The questions that Socrates asked everybody about in the square or whatever in Athens. But like, what are these things actually? And then Plato goes into like the ideal forms and whatnot. But like that tension between these kind of ideals that are like abstract and like ungraspable, but there's still something to look up to, like that divinity, that potential divinity, and then like just this mundane world that's ephemeral, that's like you take things and they go, the impermanence. um I feel like I'm not being articulate today, um but yeah, so there's that like place in between that like is so uncertain, that's so like, don't like, which way do you go? And like, so then there's suddenly like you have to go forward in either direction, or like stay in that middle place. And I think there's like these practices and hermeticism and a lot of this like Western esoteric tradition in particular does actually do a good job in like maintaining that middle place. And it's interesting because it is so much Christ influenced, in that sense of like the crucifixion and Christ being both divine and man, the whole symbolism of Christ. But so I really like that. And that's like, and I think that's what's really been drawing me to this particular path.
Exciting. Yeah, I read an article that I shared with the group on like I mean it's an interesting cognitive scientist goes into nonlinear thinking versus linear thinking, and it lined up with this book really well, or in how, and that's really I think it kind of pinpointed my critique on maybe the book, or just the author's mindset overall is just a little bit more linear. But again, the concepts, like nothing about our conversation that we just had here necessarily went in a linear direction, but we got that off of what he was saying, because the concepts are there. But and I guess by linear, it's just like, yeah, the A to B, like more like atoms, solid matter, this to that idea, and nonlinear being like the space in between, and that the probabilistic and the chaos that exists, and kind of we're writing it with the flow of what it is solid at this instance, but it's also solid and it looks like this in another instance. So having those kind of interactions within yourself and noticing how you interact with the world around you and how you create solid within like unsolid material around you or within probabilistic things around you has been really interesting for me to explore in line with this chapter, especially because he goes into that with concepts that we just talked about, you know? And he described the space in between, and then he opened up, I love, which I don't know if I'm jumping too far ahead, but like I love how he brought, just to bring in another, you know, topic, you know, meditation and prayer and kind of like bridging those and like understanding them. Like I think he did a really good job of like breaking them down. And like, yeah, I kind of disagree with like some of the like endpoints of like, you know, a savior to come and like bridge the gap between both, and it looks like this, you know, like I don't think we can ever really know what that type of thing looks like for the future. And like it could look like a lot of things. I mean, we're almost at war right now. I mean, that to me is like the where my mind went. I mean, I don't want to, I'm not projecting that out there, but it's, you know, kind of coming into the, you know, the atmosphere that this could be a possibility. And I just think that's so interesting that those are kind of the two final frontiers of like prayer versus meditation, you know, now that's like, oh, we need to bridge this gap. And it's like, this is what's happening right now. So it's just kind of, it made me like very honored to be alive in this time. And it also like, just made a different perspective off of what he was writing about, you know, in the 70s to really have that be, you know, resonant today in that type of way. So yeah, jumped ahead a bit, but we could talk about that now. Do you want to talk about prayer versus meditation, or not versus, but you know?
Yeah. Well, this is what I was gonna like mention. Oh, my personal practice, because there's like prayer is like really important to these first chapters of the Holy Heretics book. And I don't know, later I haven't gotten there, but so like I haven't really practiced prayer at all. That's not like that hasn't been at all part of my practice. Um, no, like no even mantra work. I've never done any of that. Chanting, not really. I've done, you know, I've done like an occasional kirtan here and there, but that's um but so like doing these active prayers is like is really cool, and I actually like am like totally resonating with what he's saying about these things. Um heart space, and like kind of, and it's kind there's kind of this supplication, like humbling oneself in prayer that I haven't felt in meditation, and like a certain level of egolessness that I haven't really achieved with well, I have, but it's like it seems a lot quicker with with prayer. Um for me, like because it's like just like I say, supplication to like divinity. So like allowing kind of like whatever this higher power thing is down through prayer is like seems to be really powerful so far. And it does seem to be getting to that a very similar place that like meditation gets, because he kind of like is saying that both kind of get to the same place. Is that from different directions ultimately? um and that's kind of
Yeah,
what I kind of am understanding how that works so far in my practice. That's cool.
yeah, it's like the what he calls like the moral logic, which is the logic of the head and the heart united, and the head is supposed to be like associated with meditation and the heart with prayer. And I think it's interesting because I don't know, from personal experience, I've done a little bit of both, and I've kind of like muddled the two a little bit, and I think it's very powerful. I don't know, because it's a very personal practice, but I feel like meditation sometimes is kind of like inward going out and like reaching as far as you can while letting go in like that full surrender. Whereas like prayer is like a very directed, like whatever that source is, you're tapping like straight into it and kind of like having a dialogue with that. And so there's like this inherent divinity. There's this inherent like I'm talking to God type vibe, which I think is more of like a top down type of shine, or like a little bit more like of the fool, but like from the top down. I don't know. Not explaining it great.
No, I think you're right. That's kind of what he's saying, is it is getting that top down aspect, and meditation does I think he's kind of right, and it does tend to go bottom up. The meditation, like the humanist kind of route. He's saying like it penetrates um into like direct wisdom of specific things, meditation, right?
Mm-hmm. It's a metaphysics or direct knowledge of the eternal and immutable principles, and the realization finally going beyond the world of forms to a degree of universality, which is like of pure being, which is like exactly what you're saying. Yeah, I don't know. I love this chapter so much because I felt like it was just like spearheading through things. Um, but I think he kind of like what you were saying before too, where he takes concepts that are a little bit more abstract and he kind of grasps them a little bit like a firefly. It's like you're not like squeezing it so hard that you're like crushing it and like defining it completely, but you're like holding it in your hand and you're like, oh, that's what that is. I don't know. I don't know. I felt like this was one of his more um honest pieces in the sense that it felt like he was a fool in the sense of like this purity of heart that you get from him, like reading all these chapters all the way up to this one. Like you really see like how pure like his spirituality is. So I don't know, that kind of shined through in it, and it kind of resonated with me in that way too. Because I don't know, the deeper you go into these kinds of practices and these kinds of experiences, and just even coming into contact with books like this, like the deeper you feel like you get towards that. So thank you guys for picking this book, by the way.
Yeah, it's interesting. As a kind of a side note, like I've been kind of getting this impression that, I've rejected this, like I've really had a hard time having faith in God, like in the existence of a God, that like I've been trying to like grasp what that means in this through this book. But I've actually come to this realization lately that it like doesn't matter whether or not God exists. Like, and even like labeling myself as an agnostic or an atheist or even a believer in God is like kind of irrelevant as a label. I mean, I in a sense I believe in God, but in the sense of, in a very personal sense, that it like it doesn't, I don't need to label that outwardly, um and God can kind of like, God can kind of, it's not even saying that God takes whatever form you give it, because that's like over psychologizing or something, but it's like God will exist to those who like it exists for, right? And not and but not, yeah, it's like, and so God does exist but doesn't exist. It's kind of, there's kind of a, it's neither nor, and there's some of that has like, this book has kind of helped me with that, but that like got me to that realization. But it's a neat real, I don't know, it's a neat realization for me for some reason, that like that question doesn't need to even exist. There is the kind of an in between or something there that reminds me of the Fool.
I totally agree. And actually came to that. It's so funny because I kind of came to that within reading this chapter as well. But not quite from this chapter, but also the peripheral, like the other material that I was reading that coincided with it. I was like, oh, okay. Like it doesn't really matter whether anybody does or not. Like collectively, we have like labeled, and not like we all agree on, but there has been a label of this higher power. So like it exists to some, thus it exists in the collective. Thus, like you have like possibilities of that experience within yourself that you can experience like other people have experienced. Like there's like history to go from, and also like inspiration and hope to draw towards. Like it's a very interesting guidepost, but also like that doesn't have to have like, I mean, it mainly comes again from that like nonlinear like article that I read that, I mean, my friend shared it with me. It was so interesting, but just yeah, and that you needed linear processes to have advancements in different, societal things, science, even spirituality, and different spiritual technologies. Like you need that linear thinking. But when it comes to like having a whole like embodied experience, like these concepts need to be applied in a way that's very personal and can change within, you know, what you needed to have during that time. So I'm still exploring what that means and what that looks like for like community efforts, because that's the stage of my magical practice that I'm in now. Mostly is like community and like expanding to others, before I expand out into cosmos and more into the macro of my practice. But yeah, I just find it a very like good, yeah, kind of fool starting ground to be like, okay, God, you know, all right, we can believe sometimes, we can believe if we want to, we can also not believe if we don't want to.
It's that parallelism that you're speaking.
Okay, is it?
It is.
I'm speaking parallelism.
Yes. That's some parallelism talk.
I kind of feel like, I mean, I think words are just a feeble way of humans trying to pin something down. So for me, it's clear when like there's a bunch of different words across a bunch of different cultures that all are talking about the same thing, that A, it is personal, like you said, and B, it is a community thing. So it doesn't need to be called the same thing. We don't all speak the same language. So for me, what I imagine like God or you know the great spirit of the universe, whatever, is the universe experiencing itself. It's everything and its own thing all at once, and it's constantly observing and expanding and feeling and you know going through all the things that we go through times infinity. And I find that to be comforting in the sense that like you could never be alone if you're with something like that, and that thing will do what it can for you, you know. And there is like an inherent like I'm a baby in a womb of life where like there's this just giant expanding space that I'm just in, and I get to kind of like have a free will to a certain extent within it. And you have the free will to choose like if you want to interact with it or acknowledge it, or if you want to ignore it, or you know not be able to like see the signs or the breadcrumbs, or you know think or feel deeper than you know. I don't know, but it's been a really cool experience to transcend religion to spirituality in a way that's really inclusive instead of diminishing of other beliefs. Because I can't say that anyone's right or wrong, because if they've had their interactions and feel, then like you have to trust like to a certain extent that that's their experience and that's what they feel. But I don't know. So it's so cool to have like a whole spectrum and this whole world of like different understandings that we can draw upon. This book is a really good resource for that. Yeah.
Totally agree.
The truth, yeah, and truth is so far beyond our like limited grasp most of the time, you know. And there might be like certain revelatory truth that you can attain through certain states of consciousness, and that's usually just a matter of just being present with just what is, right? You're not, there's no story, it's just like everything is just what is. um and that's, but then you can like, but then like being with the truth of like gnosis with God, that's an interesting thing too. Like there's the truth to that experience as well, right? But that's like, but that's a very personal truth. It's not like something you need to, that that needs to really necessarily be shared with anybody. So like it's the truth, I guess, like, and that's the humble, that's the humility of like of being like knowing you're only human and only in a very small perspective most of the time, and like humbling yourself to the bigger, the fact that I guess the high the like transcendent or the principle that's the higher power is truth, is like is a truth that we know we can't ever like can't ever attain like on a permanent basis. Or maybe we can, maybe that's the ideal in this, but so far it's not something we can like define, because as soon as we try to define it for other people, and that's something that I think that's what frustrates me about this book, is like I think he's defining it, And I think maybe he knows that like definition is going to be incomplete, like because he's still in a limited perspective, but a definition is by definition kind of limited, right? It's limited by um,
By
Well,
your
that's my issue. I mean, with
I
kind
can't
of like
think of the word,
people,
but
like, I mean, that was my hard thing, my hurdle to get over every chapter is like, his beliefs, I feel like are, for lack of a better word, are a little more limited than mine. I agree with what he's saying, but I can understand that all the other things have validity in an equal way. Whereas I think he has chosen one to be the higher road. And I mean that's good for anybody to know what they feel and want and stuff. But yeah, I think that was a bit challenging in reading this because I find that difficulty with discussing spirituality with people that are more religious in one degree or another, in the sense that they identify with something. It's it's harder for me to get them to understand what I'm saying, even though I understand what they're saying. So I don't know. This book is kind of like made me feel like that a little bit, but then it kind of like this chapter really kind of changed my mind about that a little bit.
What do we think when he goes into a second coming? I mean, he talked kind of a bit about that, right? Like somebody to come that will bridge what the Buddha avatar, right? Or no? Yeah. My so page 615, Maitreya Kalki, the Buddha avatar, will represent the fusion of prayer and meditation. These two forms of spiritual activity bring the motivating forces of spiritual religion and spiritual humanism. Yeah, the fire of prayer will unite with the lipid water of the peace of meditation. The alchemical marriage of the sun and the moon, of fire and water, will take place in him. Which I thought that was beautiful, like especially the last sentence. I was like, right on. But it's just so funny that it kind of always goes back to like a second coming type of thing. And in this very like somebody's gonna come to do that. I just find that so fascinating in Western I think Western religious thought, right? Like that there's because so much of it, yeah, like so much of it is archetypical and metaphorical, but it's not all that way. But then with this, it's just, yeah, I mean, my impression was the future, you can't say if it's going to be a person, if it's going to be an idea, if that's what that's going to look like. So I mean, I'm assuming you all agree, but any thoughts on that?
I mean, people have come forth and taught that kind of thing. I mean, it's not like, and it's not even new. I mean, it's like, I think the fusion of prayer and meditation has been happening for a long time in a lot of traditions in various forms. So it's kind of silly that he's like saying that that's gonna come along, and maybe that is metaphor. It just like it'll come along in an individual's life who practice these things, who understands these truths. I don't know, get there, but I don't know. It's just like I don't. It's funny that he says because he's like got a great overview of. He's got like a really brilliant overview of the world's religions for when he was writing, especially. But
Mm-hmm.
um, but he's missing a lot. There's a lot that he doesn't like. I don't think he knows anything about like indigenous traditions hardly at all. He doesn't talk about it like, and I think he would if he knew because there's like some really beautiful stuff in these things. And I mean by indigenous, I mean like indigenous North American or African or Australian, various, pretty much those
I
places.
think I think it comes through pretty clear that he does see progression in the human civilization and the human mentality. And that, I mean, in this chapter, it very clearly speaks to the centrality of the role of Christianity as a motivating force. And even speaking about paganistic experience, he does not go too much before organized paganism, like in like your state religion in Egypt. I think is as far as he goes back. He hints that there's more stuff back there, but he does seem to be talking in a way that suggests that he does not think those are things that really is relevant to any kind of conversation in terms of where he is taking this, because the progression has moved on so far away from that, and that there is this laddering. And in fact, the coming, right? What Haley used the word second coming, but I didn't get that sense at all. What I got is that there are culminations of currents, and there is trends in which eventually it gets plateaued, and then it transcends those overall trends into an entirely other thing that is the culmination of the work that has occurred. And I'm not saying that, and I think we take as people who exist right now, we take a much more postmodern view of this, in that the directionality is entirely defined by who we are, in that, but it is entirely open exploration in any direction. So I think as postmodern human beings existing at this time, we are much more comfortable with a lack of progression in that way. But there is still definitely a directionality in which these things culminate. Much like, you have waves that come together to enhance or destroy each other. There are these phenomena that are occurring, and that they come in and they do culminate in people, events, ideas that do come along when the right time. Much like when Christ was around, right? There were many Messiah type figures that were walking around. I think this is even in one of the books that we read at around exactly the same time, because somebody is essentially slated to take that role, because that is the right time in history for that idea to be fully realized. And if you even and when we talk about Western, right, this is not just purely a Western thing, because he cites examples within the Vedic tradition of the 10 the 10 comings, right? The 10 personalities that are each different, but each bring something unique. So I think these cyclical type of ideas are always being presented, and that in his presentation of the material, in his suggestion, is that there is a real sequence to this, and that these things do come together in specific combinations that can be intuited, or that can be divined, really. But both are really is essentially what I'm getting that he's saying. So people are always predicting the next coming, the next savior, the next major person, right? In business, there is the next big idea. All of these things are really speaking to the same thing, right? There is something in the ether, and that when this thing expresses itself, then 100 people around the world will have simultaneously the same thought, the same idea. A subset of those people will bring it to fruition, right? But there is definitely this idea of the progression of development towards something. I mean, even mathematics have similar concept about maximums, and that are related to like the system's maximum versus the local maximum. And there is a progression, and when you go, there is features within mathematical data that goes up, goes down. There are valleys, peaks, and there are relative heights. So and heights, take it for what it's worth, because it can be nth dimensional, which means that the height can go in any direction, right? So height is really depending upon your observational context. So yeah, so I really don't have too much problem with that, as so much material that we work with, even just from a traditions perspective, does assume that you're working towards something, and that this working towards something really is the same idea as confluence of different ideas and different thoughts in the greater context of human history, in the greater context of what has occurred, what are the major influences and powers and sources, and what that implies for the next thing that is coming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's kind of like the union of metaphorical and physical, because in the sense, like, there's like the concept in like indigenous culture, like Cody was saying, where there's like the indigo child, which is like the bridge between one thinking to another. And that's kind of like a second coming in the sense of it's a new start, it's a rebirth of humanity in the sense of ideas, but it's also there's going to be one physical person or like a group of physical people that are born into this world with that way of being able to operate in both worlds paralleled, if not at union. Like those people represent the like literal union of those two ideas and those worlds and planes and those two like counterparts. So I kind of liked it in the sense because I got to this point where I read everything as literal and metaphor now, and I try to see how I can like grapple with them as an idea if I compare those two. And this one like clicked together really well for me. And like it's weird because I'm usually like I don't, yeah, you know, like everyone's always predicting the end of the world or second coming or something, but I like the ambiguity of the idea that he has a fool's faith in the future union,
Mm.
that it will happen again, and he has like no doubt about it. There's just like an adamant, like I know this process. We've seen it before. We hopefully will see it again in our lifetime, but like you know, hope for the faith of humanity to like go in that direction is like I don't know, very foolish and very sweet and endearing. And I really love that because that is definitely like he's just emitting love, like with all his faith. And I think that's really cool in that like
There's that,
metaphor, yeah, and
there's,
physical, literal thing.
there's that word again, love, that
Mm.
Yeah.
I have so much trouble with.
Oh, sorry, not to
Is
laugh.
it
That's
because you don't want to surrender?
No, it has nothing to do with the actions. It has everything to do with the implication of the word.
What's the
Like
implications that are
the implication is that this is a fundamental condition of the human. Um, and that if we cease to love as a people, then we are not we somehow are less.
Mm.
And I absolutely do not agree with that.
Mm.
Yeah.
again,
least-
it's like
Yeah, at least our conception of love at this point, right? Our
well,
very vague 70% shared understanding
that,
of
yeah, and that's what and that's what I think of as like the transcendent, like this abstract principle of love that's like that's not we don't share a literally solid definition of that. And I think there it's kind of like the scholastic tradition trying to get to like a definition, like to like understand God through like defining the way God is in kind of through the intellect, right? And it's like a series of intellectual exercises to like unify with the understanding of God, of like an indefinable God that's not directly definable. You can't just say what God is. You have to like in the sense of like pseudo Dionysius, who Frater talks about. He like writes. He has a treatise that's listing all the qualities of God, and then he has the next treatise that's negating everything that he listed. So it's kind of like this process of like so it's like I think in the terms of love, it's like kind of I think he's kind of doing the same thing to some degree. Like love is all these things, but it's like he's not I guess he's not doing a lot of negating, but he's still leading us. It's a different it's I mean it's a different kind of process somewhat, but he's
yeah.
still kind of leading us to this place of like this definition of love that I think he postulates as, you know, God is love. Like he said that earlier in the book, and a lot of people say that now. So it's like, yeah. So I guess that's what it's exercises to get you to this place of like understanding.
Honestly, yeah, go for it, George.
I wonder if we replace the word with something different, let's say just a made up word, okay,
Yeah.
it will have as much impact in this discussion. Because really, what we are talking about now, right? He's leaning on, there is almost a trickery of the human condition to lend more force to this concept that he does not really go too much into. It is it's borrowing the power of the pseudo share understanding that we have for this word to lend them more power and more importance what his analysis has led to. I do evaluate it upon, where he ends the things often is on the concept of love, and it does not go any further. Almost as if he's assuming that many people in the world see the world in a similar way, and that this is not something up to discussion or disagreement. And this is what I have the problem with. If we label this googly gop, would it have less power? I think so, because he left it so vague that it's pulling something from within us that is shared, or at least that is mostly shared, or in some way shared, and some people is shared more than others. And this is the part that I really have a problem with. And that it's not the concept of love, because we all have our own conception of love in our current modern day understanding and definition of it. But is it really the same for everyone? Does everyone share the kind of importance this word implies? And is everybody all throughout time having the same definition of love? I kind of, my gut level reaction to this is one out of it's kind of like we're all heading in the same direction, that we know what the end destination is of, except not everybody is trying to get there. So it's that feeling of it rings a little hollow, or at least a lot hollow for me. In generally, he leaves it right at the point of love. As the end goal, as the end explanation that is supposed to really make a lot of sense, almost. Like my impression is he's just assumed that leaving it there is sufficient, as opposed to really do more into applying the same kind of rigor to that concept as he does everything else. But instead, for him, it's a destination. He does not consider it beyond that, really. He does talk about its characteristics and what it tends to do for us. Like love is constructive, love is this, love is that. But if I use the word X, is X really constructive? Is he just pointing with the word love as some quality that we share? Or maybe he's defining love as that constructive quality, which is a circular definition. So I'm applying very human sort of analysis to this, but it rings hollow for me. So for me, love is not the ultimate destination. It is only a convenient thing to organize our consciousness around for this point in our development. And that's, yeah.
Sorry. I agree.
So go ahead.
I agree because so I view it as a human kind of specific, or it's specific. So okay, on a psychedelic substance, I saw the breakdown of like DNA in this spiral leading me to the central point. It was like the DNA helix ladder being broken, falling into the center. At the center, it like said love, and then it like burst out in spirals of all of the arms, and it binded it back together, and it circled it to others, and it resonated out of where I was into the whole like environment that I was at, where there was this fall and everyone was like yelling, and then maybe this was in my head, but then everyone was cheering after, so that's kind of what I always go back to when I think of like love, is like the binding force within our like DNA structures that keeps like humans together, but also keeps us together to like somebody else. I don't think that this is ever something that can be like proven in that way, but I find it very like conditional to the human experience and to like life on earth specifically. I think that like the universe experience, and I think magic, and I think spirituality goes beyond that, like just the human experience in certain ways, or at least like a universal experience that has more kind of orientations and factors to it that can be gone beyond. And I think people go beyond that in meditative states and in like, maybe even prayer states and things like that. But when it comes to other people and when it comes to like binding forces, that's what I find like love is a really good like definition of that in like a non-scientific term.
Well, you can
Yeah, I
even
think
break it down. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say it's gonna be really hard to find a word that is that kind of binding term, and I agree with you, Haley. That
Ooh,
it,
cool.
for me, like that's
Psychedelic trip.
the word that works for that purpose. But go ahead and
But I mean,
tell me.
you could replace it with like, just for like, a basic example, like deep care. Oh, deep care is kind of like the acknowledgement that there is like an energy coming into you and an energy going out of you that kind of has a gravity that connects you with a person, a food, a movie, you know, and you can have affinity and like connection. And I think it's like more of love is more like the awareness of the depth of connection and then that sense of belonging and that sense of right and that sense of safe and that sense of connected and you may be small but you're a part of this bigger thing and you know there's less existential dread in that sense that you always feel like there's a little bit of that fool's faith you know in that trust of that like connectedness. And that's kind of like what I define love as because I think it is a hard word to explain. And I think it's so abstract and so personal that you can't really define an emotion or that kind of experience for somebody. It's kind of like an anecdotal thing. But yeah, so that's why I agree with you guys in the way that he writes about it. But I don't know, I think it's kind of interesting to kind of like throughout the book kind of figure out what he feels like love is. And then it kind of makes you have to build up your own idea of like what you think love is to kind of compare it to his writing along the book.
The way he talks about love makes it such that it is a perfected ideal for him. It's a thing it's a fundamental of his universe. Literally, he does not. I feel like he doesn't feel like he needs to explain it. He feels like everyone should understand what he's saying.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think it's like a slipstream or like a flow state, but in like a yeah,
I,
like a positive way. I don't know.
I find value in the falling out of love in the breakdown as much as I do of the build up. So yeah, in my thing, like those tearing bits were important because it got me to the center and then I was able to rebuild it back up. So like I do think it's like more of like a flow state, which is kind of what we were saying before. But I already had that preconception going in, and I definitely agree with you, George, that he did not go far enough into that, into like what, and maybe made a leap of assumptions.
yeah,
Hmm.
it might be because of the time that he's writing. There was more general consensus to directionality and purpose and ascension, and we kind of all at that time in our development more seeing from a place of agreement as opposed to a place of dispersion, which is where we are right now. It's like we're moving all, there's progression, but the progression is in every direction, and everybody is we're definitely in that Crowley described sort of age in which everyone is a star. Um, and so I feel like many of these concept seems, and rightly so or not, um, very quaint. That's what it feels like. It's like watching an old like a television show, right? Things it feels innocent. It feels it feels like that directionality is a singular point of view as opposed to a more meta, right? A more meta point of view that's supposed to encapsulate our personal experiences and understanding as our state of consciousness on an average level right now, which is not really this, right? I feel like there's a lot of angst, certainly that comes up for me, in terms of reading analyses, but also realizing that this is in another time, and that in that time, and I can remember back to this time in my own lifetime where this was a predominant sort of intellectual, like the heights of development for and the height of discussion for many of the sort of currents that he is describing. And since then, a lot has changed. and it's interesting, and in that way, reading this book feels a little bit like archaeology, figuring out what was, and what constituted some really excellent analysis for these overall trends, at least according to when he was writing, and his life experiences leading to the writing of this work and the fusion and the synthesis, right? This is someone's fool's journey. It's just not a fool's journey that is would be overtaken, would be taken by many of us today. We would do it differently, and probably should do it differently.
Well, and that's the hermetic, the part of the hermetic path of keep writing, keep like adding to the tradition.
Yeah,
And
it's not dead. It's always alive. It's always dynamic, and you have to adapt it so that it can continue, because you're the guardian, right? As he writes about that concept.
I still think that some ways, like I'm just trying to like think of the qualities of love that I feel when I feel love, and I've contemplated love a lot in my life for probably the reasons that you're saying, because it's like that was the current that I was in when I was younger too. And I think my parents used the term God as love and such. So I feel like I have a relationship to that like it does make a lot of sense to me in my life. And I totally understand where you're coming from. And I know that like in Arabic, there's several different words for love, various qualities of or various kinds of love and stuff. So there's like it's definitely a word that can be interpreted in a lot of ways, or different. There's different qualities that actually, and in Arabic, I think they probably have a better understanding of, in some ways, maybe even a better understanding of this like this transcendental abstract principle that I think he's getting at. Just because there's like the concept of ishq, which is like this kind of devotional love of like trying to attain to gnosis with God, but knowing you never will, kind of like this interesting like pulling. And it's not, and they wouldn't use that to say like God is ishik, either. So they wouldn't use that term, but ishik, but in their, I think in the Sufi tradition, that's actually a very useful word in like in the mystical tradition of reaching, of that like unattainable, and like if you read Rumi, you like read a lot about like this unattainable like love of this, a lot of it is a woman, but a woman is like a metaphor for God.
It's the metaphor for it, but it's also the path to attainment. It's that longing for the connection again. It's and that attempt to unite yourself in that, leveraging a lot of those sexual analogies to trigger a upwelling of force that elevates you. And I wonder, I mean, since we're talking about a wider or a more modern, I wouldn't even really say wider, I would say just a more modern perspective on these concepts and of direction, is I wonder what a indigenous culture would think if they heard all of this abstract description about a set of beliefs that's revolving around this concept of love. Because these words in the indigenous times are not the central focus, right? They don't use these words to describe this. Love is like the end goal of 20 centuries after spirituality has already been organized and it's also the one that's left, right? The one that killed everything else, or the few that killed everything else that is left that's used to describe. It really puts that really sharp like stake into, or that thorn into the equation, when you no longer are seeing the achievement of progression as higher than something else, right? In fact, we have, as modern people, almost as an instinct to go backwards, to maybe there was something in those deeper times of 200 centuries of us talking about or worshiping in a particular way, Instead of, oh, the last 20 coming out of that is actually superior to what came before, in an attempt to reconnect with something that is a little bit more fundamentally organically human, as opposed to this abstract experience that we keep coming to as the penultimate achievement of the Western tradition, which is a very abstract, very like idea centric, very philosophical, very analytical, progression, serial, left brain kind of way of looking at accomplishments and progression in history.
I mean, we have the privilege of comfort, though, as well, to be able to go into headier spaces in a safer environment. But I also don't think that that negates, like, I think we just transferred our pain from being more physical to being more like emotional now, or more abstract. You know what I mean? Like the pain retention rate and like humans in general, like, I don't think have like changed as much as like people want us to think. At least, or as much as I've been told in terms of evolutionary. Like, I don't know if our brain capacity or our capacity for life has changed over that time per se, but I would say that like our comfort level with societal structures have changed. Thus, we've been able to have more organized thoughts, organized institutions to be able to explore these topics in a different way, where the slight inconveniences that now hurt us as bad as the major inconveniences back then, now we can really like break that down and like talk about it in very abstract, but I mean, maybe concrete ways, you could even say, because they're like so much nitty grittier. I don't know if that helps with, I mean, I just kind of ended there, but I mean, I do think it's a different environment from the types of struggles that you had to deal with back then.
Which makes it that much more interesting
Which
that
makes
we
it that
have
much
this,
more interesting. Yep.
yeah, that we have the tendencies to want to look backwards. So many of us do anyway. I don't count myself as being one of them, but they're you know, with the resurgence of, for example, like the paganistic movements in modern, I mean, 21st century, right? Brand new paganisms. There is something about the way where we are right now that is making people look backwards, or trying to go
But
really super conservative for that certainty of mission, that certainty of prescription about how to go about doing things. So it's
but
interesting.
there's a revolution against that, like modern Wiccanism. Um, Wiccanism. I guess you're right, 21st century. But even like that book Apocalyptic Witchcraft is like kind of rebelling against some of that. It's like, and a lot of these like new neo-animist movements, like Gordon White's stuff, it's like he's not it's like taking wisdom from like these kind of old kind of indigenous traditions, but still like let's make it our own for the times. It's like this is like the time. So like in an animist tradition is like, yeah, we'll say that an algorithm is an entity, is like a living being, because everything is, right? So and then how does that make us treat the algorithm when we believe in it that way? That so it's like it's not so there is this kind of like I think now it's like this evolution from that. It's like taking things and making them relevant instead of trying to just like embrace this idea of what they were. Instead of like using creative anachronism all the time and just like reenacting, is actually like taking ideas and making them new, making them modern. And I think that those books have done a really good job with that. And I think several thinkers that this guy Rune, he's a Norse. He has
Yeah,
this like
Brenya.
Nordic animism. Yeah,
Yeah.
his stuff is really cool in that way too. Like he's done like he's a scholar and he does really good research, and then he's like, how do we do this? How do we make this ours now? And I think that's really cool work. And I don't think that is looking back. I think that's like actually looking forward.
or looking sideways. The reason why I think it's a looking
Sideways.
backward is because we're not trying to derive the same from Christianity. We're trying to reject it, right? It's a
Yeah.
reaction against this past major thing that we had. And in any such tendencies, it's a reactionism. It's a conservatism. It is a reaction against something. And I don't like disagree that, certainly personally, I like to pull from multiple sources, but always in the back of my mind is the recognition that we don't live in those times. Those are not the problems we encounter. We can't really relate to what they're saying. In fact, we only have what we think, we understand. I know what you're saying is absolutely a lie that we tell us to ourselves. We don't know. We don't have any of the context. We're projecting all of our current understanding in a historical context, or recovering something with the assumption that we actually know what they meant by what they said, or what was captured, or by
But in
secondhand.
in the examples I use, they're explicitly not
Yep.
doing that.
No,
I mean, they're
understood.
saying
But
specifically
still,
what you're saying.
yeah, but they're looking back, right?
Well, they're more looking. Yeah, I mean, they're looking at ideas and seeing how they can be adapted for like the present.
I agree.
But
I agree with that.
But I mean, that's what we all do anyways. I mean, we generate knowledge from former knowledge, so we're always looking back. I mean, it just depends on where you look. It's just a perspective. You can
Yeah.
take perspective of anything from any point in history and make it, and synthesize it in your own way.
I also think I think accessibility comes into play here as well. Most of the people that I know that practice more like pagan style ways are people who don't like, I don't know, there's an accessibility issue here that I don't want to that I hope you know what I'm trying to say. Like in different, there's a closer tied to nature for people that don't have access to educational and like resource ways. And I know that those aren't the books that you're necessarily talking about, but in some of the things that I hear being explained, like I feel like a lot of the people that I know that practice more like indigenous ways or more pagan ways or live off grid or like don't like choose not to, participate in certain ways, like also don't have access to like a lot of the same material that like that we do. Like I think there's a privilege and accessibility thing here that needs to be brought up for the video. And I'm not articulating the best right now, but yeah, that I wouldn't say is glorifying the past, but more like that's the reality that I live in, is still like taking these things, and I've taken them with me as I've gone along and blended it, and merged that with the society that I live in.
Yeah, anybody only uses what resources they have to make the best of their life, right? So like you utilize whatever you've got.
I know. We got the internet, man.
Yeah, I was gonna say the circumstances have gotten to the point where I think that individually people can make bigger changes within themselves now more than they ever have in history. There's more, I think, a lot more mobility, even though that's not negating the fact that there's like great inequality for ideas, for resources, for all the things that kind of come along with getting. I don't know. I think it's more of a collective issue in the sense that like we all need to get the world into a state in which we can create, like, continuously have more new ideas, because I think that by recycling ideas and media and books and stories and all the consumption of any pastime, that they're almost like there's like this trick to become a circle instead of a spiral. And I see what George is saying in the sense that like there's Spider-Man 28 coming out. You'd think they'd come up with something besides a Marvel movie for the last like 5 years.
Yeah, for 29, we'll just reboot 26, right?
Yeah, like we do want original ideas, and I think that the fact that there is this divergence from there's this especially in, like me and Haley's like friends, a lot of people are falling back onto old ways, but to do them in new ways. And I think that that's going to spur new technology, new music that isn't like the old thing. It's not trying to recreate it, but I think that in a way that that's they're using that as a way to kind of like slingshot back a little bit to like make a big leap forward. Because I mean, even with just like the AI chatbots and stuff like that, like all those chatbots, the more you feed them, the more you expose them to old information, the better they're gonna be at improving that technology. So there's this weird, like, I don't know if it's a human thing. I've always kind of had an issue with it too, George, where like I feel like we're always reactive and we always, draw on things that, already happened or didn't work out, or, we're trying to learn from the past. But I think by thinking differently and doing things differently, we can have a different future. And that's kind of where the Fool comes in with like, that's that fresh air and that those fresh ideas and that fresh take. I think we're getting there. I think more people are getting on board with being open-minded enough to have a world that works like that.
It's hard to
People are,
define any position without being reactive in some way to something else, right? It's hard. It's like our ego is built on that. I am this, not this, right?
well, we're
Um,
like penguins. We stack up pebbles of truths into a pile, and they're like, these are the truths that I believe, and I'm going to guard them, and I'm going to believe them, and I'm going to keep stacking pebbles on top of them to build on my truths. And I think people get very defensive about their truths. But I think the thing about truth is that it should be flexible and that you should want it to grow and change. Because if your world isn't growing and changing, then you're not expanding your mind and you're not engaging with it. You're kind of just stuck in this bubble. Like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of people in the US can tend to be like that, where they'll be like, oh, as long as I go to yoga and I feel good, my spirituality's fine. And you're like, okay, you like going to a yoga class that's not like how it's meant to be. Like, it's not a spiritual thing here. It's more of a physical activity that people do to stay in shape. They're not like, there's a different intent going into it. And I think that because, you're not going to get much out of yoga if you're constantly just like, I'm going to go get ripped, like I'm going to get fit. It's more about that flow state that you're trying to get into. And you're not going to get to that level if you don't think that way. Or, if you're not exposed to that information to know that that's what yoga really is a flow state. It's not about learning the poses and knowing how to like do a handstand perfectly. And I think that, I don't know, I think this world kind of convolutes material for something more than it is. It's like the iceberg effect. It's like, yeah, like the physical world and this material world is indicative of what's going on, but I don't think it's necessarily like proof. If anything, it's like a reactive shadow of the thing because it's already happened by the time you notice it.
So let's bring this back, right? Here's a quote right in front of me, and I think it's an interesting juxtaposition to what kind of we've been talking about. Metaphysics as a direct knowledge of eternal and immutable principles, and as the realization of finally going beyond the world of forms to a degree of universality, which is that of pure being, is the only one of the applications of meditation. and it is by no means the only one, right? So we are talking about truths and mutability of truths, right? And here in a quotation about metaphysics, it's talking about the transcendence of the changeability of forms and presentation and mutability. These are things that are atomic. They're not changeable. They're literally, the world is composed by these things which are eternal, right? This is yet another way, another kind of and another kind of passage that suggests there are these things and you can point at them, but you don't really want to talk too hard about what they are because they're just slightly outside of your reach, kind of like love. But I think it's interesting that he's using it in terms of a definition, where he's pointing out someone who's using it as a definition for metaphysics, something that is beyond human level knowledge, something that is beyond, just beyond what we can arrive at using our usual techniques. even though it's totally available to us as well. So I think it's kind of speaking out of both sides of the mouth about a concept. Yeah. What do you guys think about that? Do you feel like you
Yeah.
encounter those things when you're in your own practice? You encounter the metaphysics. We use that word so much.
I believe so, but I think it depends on, circumstances and everything. But I think true alchemy is being aware of everything that you can and to draw on that knowledge, like without thinking or questioning it, just to experience it. And then you can reflect upon it later, once you've come out of the meditation. You're not really like sitting there thinking about your meditation while you're meditating, or you'd be kind of like wasting your time a little bit. I think it's better to kind of open yourself up to the experience of that thing, kind of like the fool, where it like surrenders into kind of trusting that there's an experience worthwhile that they're about to go through, instead of trying to define it. But I don't know. I don't know. I love words, and I'm an English major, but I have a really big problem with words in general, because I think that they fall so short of what we actually mean, that the concepts that we all talk about every day, all the time, are not articulated properly or with the depth and the respect and like the meaning that they deserve. So love is just one of them. But I feel like that about most things. Our language is so limiting. That's why I don't know. Certain languages like Japanese, they got like a word for everything that's very specific. And I love that. But I also find that like if you have to have so many words for like snow, then you know that you can't describe it in a word. It's like almost indicative of that you have to like trust that there's this, I don't know, there's this undescribable quality where like they're talking about with Sanskrit, when some of the words aren't even in Kabbalic, like the words are shaped and sound the way that they're supposed to articulate the meaning of the thing that they're talking about. It goes beyond just this piece of paper that has this word printed on it. It's a very 3 or 4 dimensional word, which I don't know, I try to read more like that, or like interact with definitions more like that. But the world's not always that way.
That's interesting, right? Because that implies that somebody has reached that point and then tries to bring it back. And if that's the case, why isn't our language like this?
I think they want to keep us docile. Not they, like there's one they, but I think that people that want
We want to
control.
keep us docile.
Well, yeah, we are the biggest problem that we have is ourselves. But I think that there's people that, would prefer to stay in a circle than spiral, or, to see, I think it's kind of interesting because a lot of the people that, want to be here for when Jesus comes back, or when there is like the second coming, are the same people that don't want anything to change. Well, how do they expect for the second coming to happen if nothing changes? You can't keep things in the same circumstance and expect like something to arise from that. Like was saying with people
I
in their
mean,
lives, like, why do I keep having the same problems? Because you're making the same decisions. You already kind of like know the proof in that pudding, but you can like go somewhere else. Like there is a higher calling, or like a deeper truth that you can find if that dead end for you, like there's other ways.
And thus the central problem of this explanation of the Fool, which is the dark side of it, right? You can head down, guided by revelation. And it might not even be your own revelation, right? It could be revelation in the book of Revelations. And through your own experience, you've kind of made up the story, or someone has given you a view of that revelation in such a way that you will act like the Fool, right? You will walk your earth thinking that the second coming is coming, and therefore nothing needs to change. And actually, that is your expression of your faith. And so who is to say that this version of it is less valid than any other version of the Fool walking their path? And if that is the case, then why even present all this argument about the Fool? Because we are already essentially doing that. Some of us awake, some of us not, but it's all a choice about how and where we are in our life circumstances. All of the same questions about nature versus nurture comes back up in that discussion as well, which is to say, why even talk about the Fool, when we're continually engaging in what we believe in, what we act as if we believe in, right? So, I mean, I think for me, it's useful to talk about it only in the sense that have you considered it, right? Have you considered whether you are conscious to these choices, but it does not invalidate any position. So therefore, it's nothing more than a suggestion to someone to introspect or to extrospect, or to look up, or to union, to reach for union with the divine, only as a hey, here's just something else you might want to think about. Nothing like a prescription, nothing like it's right or wrong, right? And this is the essential problem of our postmodern world, which is nothing is right. There is no directionality. Everybody is doing the right thing, and that there is no better. There is just different. And this is where something like this totally falls short, because it is how we arrived at this point, and there's no solutions, and there's no real suggestion as to how we can dig ourselves out of our current predicament, which is the result of this development, by the way.
Yeah.
So this is the frustrating thing about this sort of analysis. It is also quite beautiful in its analysis and its construction, and that it does point at something. But you have to really take it in the context in which it was constructed, and so it's like it's a kind of a give and take, right? Because we do have this context as part of our historic legacy heritage, as part of our birthright. This is where it came from. And now in today's world, it does not really offer anything new in terms of what we are facing today. So I do feel like when I'm reading this book, like I'm looking at a rerun of the Brady Bunch, right? For example, not to make light of the brilliant synthesis and analysis, but it gives me that same sense of nostalgia. Like this is a product of a time that is no longer, and that it is relevant only in the sense that there are people who can still remember what it was like, and that maybe these people can then construct or present the case in a different way, right? Much like what Cody had pointed out, like the mutation and the keeping anew of this thing so that it can continue as a practice, as a prescription.
I think it's almost like an invitation to cultivate your own union. I don't know, whenever I read like philosophical books that are vague or like open-ended, I almost feel like they're almost admitting, not like defeat, but they're admitting that they don't know how to explain it to you, or that you're going to have to explain it to yourself and have your own experience with it, which I find to be like an invitation to grow and like have that union or that synthesis with how do I grapple with like the straddling of time, in the sense of like looking back versus like having like original and organic experiences in the here and the now. But I don't know. I agree with like the writing style in this book, and specifically about love, because I mean, I feel like for him to over explain so much of other things and then to kind of like land on that word, and then it, almost like hot potato, he's like
Anyway.
Yeah, I think that nature, Earth in general, is like prone to change, that change is just a part of our process of things. So yeah, I mean, I kind of forgot where I was going with that, but that kind of speaks to what, like, I think that those who choose to stay in stagnant states do find that it's harder to continue those states for longer periods of time, because I think the tendency is for something to switch up, and that doesn't seem to make any type of movement go on. I don't know if that's insight. That's kind of going backwards, but
yeah, which for a lot of people is a sense of stability and comfort. And
well, people don't like. Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just saying that
yeah.
For some people that is not a problem. In fact, that is the solution.
I think we're at a time where there's not a lot of like places to hide anymore and to feel like there's not a lot of comfortable states all around, just because we do have access to like what's going on all around us. Like it's harder and harder to stay in those states for like more and more people are starting to feel unsafe in more and more ways because we are in such a high point of change. I think. I mean, maybe that's just what I see, but
Well, I think the people that grasp onto things that aren't concrete, like abstract concepts, during a time of great change are going to fall apart because they don't have anything to actually hold on to. And so those are the people that really, really challenge change as like a negative thing when if you were in a flow state or if you were, kind of communing with like a divine or a higher, frequency or, just kind of like expanding yourself in your experience, knowledge, and acceptance, you would be able to unionize, what was and what is. And I don't know, I think that our world is having a lot of mental illness because of that grappling of acceptance of whether it be trauma or circumstance or, the geopolitics. I mean, earthquake just shattering to bits a war-torn country that's still in the midst of it and no one can go in and help them. Like, how do you even grapple with that as a human standing in like a fallen building, being like, no one's coming for me? You know, like I think that people have gone, this is gonna sound fucked up. Bear with me though. I think people have gotten soft in the sense that they don't like challenging their faith and the things that they grasp onto because those things are abstract. And if they are challenged and they withstand that challenge, then you can grow stronger and closely more connected and a little bit more, I don't know, just more. But I think a lot of people when they do get tested, they I don't know, they deny it. So instead of allowing there to be two parallel things, they're like just no, 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 like reject, reject, reject. And I think it's kind of causing intellectual issues to say the least in our world where there are people that want things to be different and there are people that don't want things to be different. And I think it takes imagination and a little bit of trust and faith in yourself and other people that want that collective vision to know that that will happen, whether anybody tries to stop it or not. That, I mean, change will come. What it looks like is up to us, and we can kind of shape that to an extent, which I find to be exciting. I always kind of like look to the future and think like what we could be or what we can do. And like, I don't know. There's a lot going on right now for people, and I think that the COVID kind of pulled them inward and people weren't ready. They got like a little whiplash because their external world is their identity. My gym, my friends, my bar I go to, like those things were our people's identities. And now they didn't have those things for a while. And then they had to build an identity within themselves. And I think that that was one of the biggest blessings that like we've gotten in a long time, even though it was like in a horrible circumstance and like, silver lining of a terrible, terrible time. But I think that was really important for people to go through because we hadn't been tested before. We'd had so many, like you guys say, luxuries and like modern conveniences and kind of creates that false sense of security. And I think it was good to shake it up and be like, yeah, no, your system is broken. We need to fix it. Or like, we're going to break the system. Like the system's just going to get like a straight like kibosh.
See, I think you're getting to something, I think, in this book, even like the moral logic. Like, it's like you know that like you have like a sense of like the way you're speaking, Britannia, is like a sense of justice, like a sense of like that things could be better. And that's that moral logic, right? That's like it's like bringing a right like a rightness to it. And I think I mean, it's still hard. Like, no matter what our perspective is going to be, like, um, what we'll diagnose like the problem, and then and like from our perspective, and then come up with a solution from our perspective. And of course, that perspective is limited by its very nature. So, like, what is it that we can cultivate? And I think this book is getting at like this moral logic idea is like, what is it that we can cultivate this moral logic that's like that is actually a transcendent logic that is beyond our individual perspective. And that's like, that's what I really love about, like, that's what I'm really like getting out of this, in this kind of practice from this, is like in having somewhat of a leap of faith that like that's a worthwhile path to go on, to like find some kind of transcendent justice like sense in myself, so that I can act from a place from that logic, more than just my limited like judgments from my like just like diagnostic um, um point of view.
So let me ask you a question, Cody. And you know, obviously we all share way more in common than we are different. So our analysis, our instincts will point to very similar things. But let's just for argument's sake, that you and I both set out on a journey to develop our moral logic through practices, but we reach completely different conclusions. And that we act totally and authentically according to our conclusion that we have come to, working our moral logic, becoming whatever that download is, we act according to it with no hesitation, you know, with the dog biting us in the pantaloon and just going forward, right? I mean, you know, that what's your instinct around that? Because this book, you know, like I said, I feel like there is this assumption that if we only did this, then we would reach similar conclusion. Which, by the way, I personally, I totally prescribe to that, because I do believe in that we share way more in common than we are different, and that regardless of our cultural programming, we still are mostly human. We're human first in the percentage of composition, culture next, programming the even smaller percentage. And that's why I still believe that these practices have power, in that they can transmit information across the ages, because we're still fundamentally pretty human, regardless of the time that we live in. But what if we come to wildly different conclusions and act out of those, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, even like in our readings of these books, we could probably come to, I mean, from this book, with our somewhat shared in understanding of the words, we could come to completely different conclusions following
Yeah.
his logic, for sure. But I think, yeah, and I think that points to the fact that this book is and the words he uses are can only be um can only be taken from, I mean, no matter what, like we all engage in any material from our own perspective. Again, you're right in that sense, and we're only I'm only interpreting his words from my own, with my own like experience. And a lot
As
of
we
it
all
and a
as we
lot
all
of
do,
it
right?
I interpret it metaphorically in ways
Yeah.
that he doesn't mean at all, I'm sure. Like,
Yeah.
but so I can only, yeah, you're right, I can only make of it what I will. And you're right, there might be like totally different paths and different moral conclusions. Therefore, like, there's like, I mean, we share culture. That's I mean, that gets to the like the point of shared culture, is that this like shared understanding, like shared encoded meaning with language. And that gets like to answer your earlier question about like why 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 English isn't like encoded in the same way Sanskrit, because like English is based on a different set of values, you know. um
Yeah. Or several
Yeah.
different types of values.
Islam has the word ishq for like divine love, that kind of divine yearning, because they value that divine yearning, like, and we
Yeah.
don't have a word for that so much. Um, so like, so yeah, I mean, like that's why we can live in shared communities of, um, where we can like develop, um, this certain kind of morality based on this encoded text, this magical text, these magic words. But
I mean, we're kind of in a state right now. I mean, for women's rights, um, people are either they're not, against anything, but they're either pro-life or they're pro-choice. But both people have like a moral belief that's deeply rooted in the sacredness of life and the value of that. And one is saying, I value the woman's right to choose what happens to her body, and one saying I value the life of this thing that I'm trying to advocate for, that I believe is life that will come into this world. And I'm not saying anyone's right or wrong there, but there's like this moral, uh they're not seeing eye to eye, but there's got to be a way to like create a union between those two, because like like George's example is exactly what this is in modern day, like real time right now. Like people have this deep moral belief, women and men on both sides. It's not about like class or sex anymore. It's, it is how deeply people care and how much, weight that gives them. But that seems to be the crux that we can't get past right now. And I think it's interesting to be alive in this day and age to watch deep moral rifts have to be conquered to be able to move forward. I mean, like the next few elections and stuff are going to be a little bit wonky, and I think that this is going to play a big role in that. And I think it's interesting that what is it, like 75% of candidates have to identify as like a specific religion to do better in votes in polls. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So, like they have to kind of like put themselves into a box to be accepted. So it's like, how can we think that we're a progressive nation if we're constantly cutting people down and trying to, appease the masses? But I mean, the masses are who are voting for that person. And so they want to represent as many people as possible. So I don't know. It's like a real time example of that exact rift that you're talking about, of like moral beliefs, and like, both people are having like a deep deep connection to that thing, and they both believe that they're 1,000,000,000% right with all of their heart. There's no way to tell anybody that they're wrong. I don't know. Yeah, it's just interesting.
I think we should make all men have vasectomies, and there should be no more babies at all. That's my moral stance.
I want a baby.
I think nature's doing it for us. I mean, that's,
Nature's doing that.
yeah.
Oh God.
I think due to the sheer number of people on this planet, I think the adjustments are starting to get made, right? Like we're just stopping having babies in the negative population growth for the supposed developed countries. It does speak to those adjustments that are occurring even as we speak, right? We're going to create even more problems from that, but only for the human.
Yeah, China is already seeing those problems.
Yeah, it's gonna be horrible. Like it's gonna be horrible for us as well if we don't, we don't import people, right? To drive the engine of our society. We are still a neo-slave society, and we operate with all those still same principles, just in different forms, right? And so I think societally speaking, and just from purely human existing in this world and in this kind of a closed system, that these adjustments are already happening, already being made. We're talking about reduction of the number of people out of sheer necessity and resource competition, and birth rates declining, or people just really actually don't want to have any babies. It kind of speaks to the adjustments that are already starting to happen. Climate change as well, right? It's adjustment in the system to kind of re-equalize to our lowest share common denominator, in my opinion. So that's good. It's fine. It's not going to be great for any of us, but it's necessary. It's necessary change. In this, I want to relate it back to this chapter, because we kind of have really kind of taken a side road, which is the sense of acting beyond human reasoning, beyond, like, we're having a conversation and we are talking in a way that is reasoning, right? Reasonable, and that we share some of these reasoning so that we can come to agreements or share our perspective on a particular topic. But from what he is suggesting, this moral logic comes out of things that are beyond us, right? It's a super sensible, superhuman beyond any one person. And so therefore these moral understandings or these moral imperatives, right? This morality can in fact have anti-life tendencies as well, because they are speaking to greater trends beyond any one person, for the ultimate trajectory of human beings, if that's even a thing that we care about anymore. Um, and so therefore, what gets downloaded can actually be pretty horrifying in the as it's being executed, as you bring it down and you're actioning out of it, out of pure conviction. It could be like, genocide of entire groups of people, right? Because you're purely acting out of this conviction, out of this I see in the clarity of my union that this is what must be done for right now to save us all. For example, would be like a justification that all super villains would use, right? And but how do you argue with that perspective, right? And so once again, we come to this, we come to this juncture in which in this chapter in particular, and I think the Fool is the perfect way to capture that the words themselves are both a suggestion and an admonition at the same time, in that the application of this, if not done in some kind of controlled or skillful way or guided way, will have unintended consequence for not only the people practicing it, but maybe for all of us, right? So, so it's I have mixed feelings about this chapter, because it kind of leave it to you, and it kind of assumes that we will be acting out of good, and that the states that we reach, even out of good intentions, would be good. And I simply do not agree with that. I simply I cannot agree with that, in the sense that we don't see on the same time scales. We don't have the same understanding of what good is, and that there might be some shared human good, but it's not the same across all of humanity. And thus, it's my frustration with all things that are kind of suggesting this. And it doesn't really present a solution. It doesn't really present a way forward. It simply suggests a way that assumes that we share some sense of goodness that is in, and it's purely numbers based as well. Like a percentage of us, which is the vast majority, must have the following for this to actually kind of make sense. For even any time, right? Some place in time for this to make sense, because maybe 200 years from now it would be completely different. They will come to completely different conclusions, maybe even very different than our conclusions. And so it's a doozy in terms of that. I do feel like it's very beautiful in its presentation. It's also very it assumes a homogeneity we are no longer innocent enough to believe in.
I could end with
Yeah, I mean,
go for it.
that kind of destroys. I mean, your argument is an argument that kind of destroys my faith in anything. I mean, in doing anything. It's kind of like, in a sense, like my feeling when I hear what you just said, George, is like just to give up completely, kind of, which is interesting. And I'm just saying that that's kind of what that's like. And I've had that, and this is like, these are thoughts I've had
Yeah.
many times in my life. I mean, it's not a new thing that
It's interesting that words that you read on the page lifts you to that place where you do have that tendency to want to strive. But then other words bring you back down. So like so words coming off the page from another human being, right? This is purely in the Buddhist way. Like human analysis with our human limited understanding, talking about it in using human language, right? Have these profound effects upon your life strategies. And there's something there, man. There's something you have to challenge within yourself about why that is, why the locus of control is so distant that you're being pulled so easily in those directions. And
You're
according
saying
to
me
this,
personally?
or anybody who is easily swayed one way or the other, right?
Right.
Like the whims of, like the directions of the wind, that the zephyr is blowing from the west and now I'm going east, and all of a sudden there's a southerly wind and now I'm going this way. There's these fundamentally very powerful shifts in consciousness, or kind of instinct to act just based on words. It's like it's pretty interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like that's like defines me really well. Actually, I do that all the time. That's like kind of how I am with
Yeah,
things.
so I can
And
see why
so like,
reading would be attractive, right? It really presents a case and you can be driven in a particular
yeah.
direction. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've read like fantasy and science fiction my whole life, so like that's like, you know, I love it. It's like, but it doesn't, but yeah, like where, and that's true. Like I don't have a locus of control. Like I have no idea where that is. You know, it's like it's kind of wild. Like, and that's kind of maybe fundamentally one of my problems in life. Like a certain lack of like locus. Yeah.
Yeah,
And like,
and to explore, and when you meditate, right, and you go into that space and it's just empty, right? It's silent. It's there, or maybe it's not, right? Do you not find that there is clarity in direction in that place?
there's emptiness and no direction.
Interesting.
It's like, and it's awesome. I mean, it's like, yeah. I mean,
So do you feel like meditation is an escape, in that it relieves you of the burden of having to decide or choose?
um, somewhat, yeah.
Interesting.
Um, but you know, I still have to choose what I'm gonna do for meditation or practice, you know. Um, and there is a locus, there's something there, there's a
Yeah.
drive.
Yeah. There
For
is a
sure.
place.
And there is somewhat of a drive, and I resonate with this book because there is somewhat of a drive for like actual truth. Like, and I think that's the thing. It's like I understand that like all truth is conditional, you know, on this planet, and all truth is only comes from perspective. So you have to, everybody's swayed by something. I mean, there's no like independent locus of control. I mean, in his sense, maybe there is. Maybe there's some eternal soul that has that. I mean, he's defined it in several places in this book.
Yeah.
So, like, I guess that's just the thing. It's like, what is that? Like, I'm a product of my society, you know, and my upbringing, which is like this postmodern world of infinite distraction. So, of course, like, I'd be blown around with the wind of influence, different things.
Yeah. It's interesting. There obviously there are no right and wrong ways in our postmodern world. Of course, there are right and wrong. I mean, I do a lot of argumentative analysis, but I mean, even for me, right, there are definitely things that are more right than others, certainly for the time, right, or for the group of people. Even if you want to be this reductionist and be like material objective analysis, everything, there are still things that are better for a well-defined amount of time for a particular assemblage of people at a particular place and time, right?
And
And
for
and
specific purposes.
and for specific purposes, and maybe there are other people working against you, but that does not preclude you from doing the things that you want to do, right? Doing the things that you just kind of naturally act out of. And I think this is one of those things in esoteric that people arrive at is, the subjective has validity, and it has a validity um, in equal quality, in equal quantity for you versus someone else. And if you consider the objective cannot actually be experienced and it is purely an agreement, then you can make a strong argument that the subjective actually has more reality to you as an individual. And in that, right, there are rights, there are wrongs, and that the authentic expression of your right and your wrong is actually your purpose, right? It's actually not to be distracted by and maybe you are swayed, and that is part of what's right and what's wrong. But at any point in time, there's this impetus to act. There's impetus to explore, and there's the impetus to grow in that, and to make the mistakes and to learn from them, and to continue to evolve yourself. And I think the esoterics teach us this very clearly, that there is this seeking, there is this expression, and it is unique to you. And that whatever form it comes, you don't judge yourself by what's around it, because it's beyond you. It surpasses your limitations at all times, and you get to lift yourself out of your circumstance, out of your condition, out of your biology, out of your physical inheritance, or emotional inheritance, and to discover what those impulses are. It's true will, right? That's exactly what we're talking about here. It's to work out of the true will.
Well, and I mean, being moved by ideas, I think is like, it's like, I think that's part of the exploration. I mean, I don't think like being, I mean, I felt like maybe I felt judged by you, George, by the way you said, like, to be, that you're moved, like so easily moved by these words, in like different directions. And I actually am now thinking that that's like a good thing, because it's like I'm finding an equilibrium, and I'm not moved to the point of like joining a cult, like people are moved to the point of like fully embracing like some particular charismatic guru, like I would never do that.
Well, and you
Like,
have refined
because
art.
I try things out, and I'm like measuring different options. And
I mean, you have good taste in your material too, and you have a critique on like all of like your perspective like rings true for, I mean, at least for what I've known you in book club, and you've recommended almost every book in book club. Like, like what good like source, kind of material comes from, and like what is valuable to explore further, and are adaptable and can change those ideas. Like that's like invaluable in an age where we have so much to consume, and you nail it on the head for like most of what we pick. I don't know. I'm not trying to hype you up, but I'm just saying like, but I will.
I appreciate that.
No, certainly don't interpret observation for judgment.
Yeah.
I completely don't, because
no, I was just admitting to that's like the feeling I got, but like I don't know.
I mean, it's just really pointed, directed observation, and it's because it is so dynamic coming across the screen, right? It goes from, wow, I'm really excited for this exploration, to, wow, this really takes me back to that place of no exploration, right? I don't want to, I just want to be in this place, and it's all within the span of one Zoom conversation, which is pretty dramatic, right? So I do have to point that out, because it is pretty, if somebody's watching this video, right, and they come up with that, they're probably going, wow, that's a dramatic shift, right?
So I think a lot of people relate though too, because I related to what you were saying. And I mean, George, you're such a fascinating storyteller too. And you really take us there. So it's like, we really feel like what
I'm just doing what he's doing.
Yeah, for sure.
It's setting up the situation and then making the point, right? But which is exactly what he does. So eloquent. He does it so much better than I can do. But the way that he's writing, and this is why I admire about this book, is that he is practicing basically what he is laying out from chapter to chapter to chapter to chapter, and we're experiencing the end result of this lifetime of work, right? This lifetime of fusion. Even if we don't agree with it, we respect it. it does change our perspective. It does broaden our horizon and maybe get us to think about things that, oh, those other people over there, there's a lot of evil that was committed doing that. When in fact, maybe the drive was this beautiful thing that is behind their faith. That is really their end goal. Like a beautiful, like thinking process, a beautiful faith, a beautiful union of the two to produce something wonderfully and breathtakingly beautiful, which is this book, in my opinion. Regardless of my analysis of it, I think my instinct towards this book is I am so glad I'm reading this book.
Yeah.
I think most of us have said that in one way, one way or another, right? In some way, shape, or form. Yeah.
I feel like it's an important read for a magical group to read, a circle to be reading. So I'm grateful. I feel like this quote kind of wraps everything up and also like directly points to what we were last just talking about. So on page 616, the fool is therefore the arcanum of the transformation of mental turmoil, the schizophrenia of two consciousnesses not in harmony with one another into wisdom. Wisdom, and that's a question mark. Like, what does that mean? But that's cool that we were in like a mental turmoil, schizophrenic state there for a second, and just pulling it back to wisdom.
Yeah, good one.
Any final thoughts?
I'm glad I'm glad we're almost done with this book.
Me too.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
One more chapter. I can't believe it. I feel like I was like, we're never gonna finish this book, and I'm like, oh my God, we finished.
We're one chapter away from finishing this book, so definitely everyone be looking for possible suggestions. Maybe not something that's involved.
22nd century, whatever we're in
Let's do
right
something
now.
more modern. Like, do you
What
guys have
about
any suggestions of like what
We're
you're
gonna talk
talking?
next week. Fiction, maybe.
Yes.
So bring your book suggestions next week, and we'll talk after we discuss the world. And
Yeah.
so
All
let's
right.
save that because I don't want to keep because we could all talk about what books we're reading.
Yeah, we gotta wait till we finish this one. You're
We're
right.
too excited. All right, I'm ending the. Oh, whoops. Ending the